The most important part about buying a piece of land is also the hardest part, and that's figuring out what the land you're buying is actually worth. For example, this 1.6 acre property in Kenly, North Carolina is listed for sale at $45,000 in a local market where similar pieces of land recently sold for as low as $42,000 and as high as $78,000. So based on the nearby sales activity, there's a very wide range of potential values for the property that is being listed. So if you actually wanted to buy it, it's hard for you to know if you're getting ripped off or if you're getting a good deal on that piece of land. My name's Alex Reese, and I've bought over $5 million worth of land, and a lot of the deals that I did, in fact, the majority of them were done on the very first phone call I ever had with the seller. And it happened when I had never even seen the property before. I'd not seen it on site, and I hadn't even done any local research on the property online. And yet, when I talked to that seller, in about 2 minutes, I was able to get them a cash offer over the phone and have a pretty good understanding of what that land was worth. The reason I was able to do that is I developed a system where I ask 5 particular questions about a piece of land, and I go to find the answers using free online databases like Zillow. So there are 5 questions that I use whenever I'm looking at a piece of land to get a really good gauge of value. And the 5 questions that I ask myself about a piece of land are: what's close, what's recent, what's average, what's similar, and what's selling. I'm going to talk to you about each of those 5 questions, what they actually mean in the context of looking at the value of a piece of land, and how each one of those steps contributes to a very accurate estimate of the value of the land that you're going to be buying. The first question that I ask is, what's close? And that question, when you're talking about close, it has to do with proximity or location. And that's the most important aspect of real estate, is the location of the property you're talking about. When I look at what is close, what I mean by that is to go on Zillow and I center on the subject property that I'm evaluating, which in this case is going to be the 1.6 acres that we talked about previously. I'm going to set my filters so that I'm looking just at sold data. I want all property types, including land and homes and everything else with it. I want all acreage, so all size property, and I want those sold comps across all the historical data that I can get. So typically for Zillow, that's going to be 36 months. When you zoom in on the location of the property and you set these filters, what you're able to see in the panel on the right side of your screen are the overall price points in the area, not just for land that is similar to the land that you're evaluating, but more importantly for location is going to be the value of the homes and the neighborhood home values near the land that you're buying. Generally speaking, raw, undeveloped land is worth approximately 20% of the value of the homes in that neighborhood. So that when you look at the homes in this location, what you're able to see nearby this property are that homes are selling anywhere in the range of about $215,000 to $340,000. However, on the property that we're evaluating, I would guess that the buyer that would buy that piece of land is most likely to build a double-wide manufactured home on that property. And if that is the case, typically I think a conservative value based on the numbers in this area for a double-wide manufactured home is about $250,000. So based on a $250,000 home on this property and taking 20% of that number, just by looking at this first segment of the market, you can already gauge the value of this land somewhere in the range of $50,000. Now, the next question I always ask myself after what's close is going to be what's recent. When I ask about what's recent, I want to look at all recent sales of land of any size as close to the property as I can. So what I'm going to do is set my filter to land only. I'm going to look at all acreage ranges, all property sizes, and I'm going to look at the last 6 months of sold history. Then I'll zoom out until I'm close enough where I'm still able to get at least 10 sold comps in the right-hand panel of my screen. So when I can see enough data, this is going to help me understand the recent trends of what kind of land has sold recently in and around this market, what the price points are for certain types of land, how much it's selling for, and then also the particular comps that are near to this property to get a gauge on the value and the acreage that people are buying. So when I look on this sample, I can see 2 properties that stick out to me. First is this 1.87 acre property that sold at $70,000, and then this 2.47 acre property that sold at $112,000. The first property is similar in size to the subject property, but it has the advantage of having a very large open clearing with level ground. So the combination of those two factors may represent a cost savings of about $15,000 to $20,000 when compared to our subject property. So it makes sense that it sold at $70,000 and that it's a little bit more valuable than ours. The second property, in addition to being substantially larger, this one is 2.47 acres, it also has a lot more road frontage on that county road it's located. What that means is that you have enough road frontage to break that property into two separate building lots that you could individually sell for between $65,000 and $70,000 a piece. So just looking at those two properties, I'm actually getting a lot more comfortable with my initial $50,000 estimate because both of these two properties are more valuable for specific reasons that I mentioned. The next question I want to ask is, what is average? And when I say average, I'm not talking just about a statistical average, although that is something that you certainly can do. I mean average in terms of typical. Like, what's typical? What's a typical piece of land that is similar to our subject property actually going to sell for in this market? So what I want to do is actually narrow in my acreage filters to 1 to 2 acres, or if I was looking at another size property, I want to narrow the window on acreage tight around the size of the property that I'm looking at. We're going to look at the last 12 months and I want to zoom out until I get at least 10 comps. But in this case, what I'm running into is that I have to zoom too far out in order to get a substantial data set. And so what I want to do is actually zoom back in and take my lower bound from 1 acre down to a half acre. So I can look at 0.5 acres to 2 acres. Because I would much rather have a wider lens on acreage and a tighter lens on location than a similar size property that's located halfway across the county, because location is going to be senior to acreage when it comes to valuing land. Now, what I'm going to do is to isolate the comps that show up in Zillow that are marketed comps. What that means is that I don't want to take any of the system-generated data. If it has some system-generated numbers, but it didn't actually have a listing and it wasn't marketed, it doesn't have real photos, I'm going to exclude it from consideration because that means you can't actually verify the details of that property. It may be a home that's sold. It may be a property that's sold off market. It may be a property that's sold in a bundle of other properties that sold with it. So we're just going to look at marketed comps when we take our data set. So now when I look at my data set, I have 8 values, I have 8 comps. The lowest property that sold in this particular filter was a 0.51 acre property that sold at $27,500. And the highest comp in this data set is a 1.7 acre property on South Corbett that sold at $78,000. When you calculate median, typically when you have a number of values in a data set, you want to take the centermost value. So if you have an odd number of records, like 7 properties, for example, you would take the 4th property from the top because that's the centermost value, that's your median. Here though, we have 8 properties in our data set. What that means is that our median is going to be the average of the sold price on the 4th and 5th highest sold property. When we calculate that median, we reach a value of $63,750. And this is where I start to reconsider my value because I had been at $50,000 before, but now we're seeing a center of gravity, a price point in this market that's actually going to be a little bit higher. And when you actually scrutinize the properties in this data set, I'm starting to get a feeling like maybe our numbers might be a little higher than 50,000. For example, this 0.85 acre wooded lot sold at $65,000 despite being about half the size of our subject property and being wooded and also being located in a deed restricted subdivision. Looking at the average or median values brings me to a point where I'm comfortable going to about 55,000. The next question that's on my mind at this point is what's similar. When I look at the data set that I've established in the previous step, when I took my median, I had 8 values, 8 properties that sold. The lowest one was at $27,500, the highest one was at $78,000, and the median was at $63,750. I almost think about it like a classroom because when I compare my subject property to the particular properties that are in that data set, I pretend that the highest property is like the valedictorian of the class and that the person that is at the very bottom of the class, the lowest ranked student, is the lowest priced sold comp. And I always think about how good is my student? How does this student compare to the other students in the class? Because when you're comparing land and you're looking at acreage, you're always going to look at the wrong thing first. The value of land fundamentally has to do with the character of the property. And so when I talk about what's similar, what I want to do is go into this data set and I want to find the sold property that is closest in kind, closest in character to the property that I'm evaluating. In this case, I think the most similar sold comp in our data set is this 1.4 acre property on Acox Crossing Road that sold at $42,000. The reason that I think that it's the most similar is that just like our subject property, this property is located on a county road. It has very similar acreage, so it's similar size property, and it's also mostly wooded with a small clearing, just like the property that we're comparing it to, plus the fact that it has no deed restrictions. And despite its similarity, my property that I'm looking at is probably, at this point in my head, $55,000 give or take, but the sold comp that I'm comparing it to only sold for $42,000, which is a little bit disconcerting. And so what you have to do now is look at the price history, look at the history of that listing when it sold on Zillow, because it's very illuminating. What you see is when they brought this to market, it sold in just 13 days on market, and that's incredibly fast. And what that suggests to me is that they actually could have gotten more for this property. They probably could have gotten $50,000 or $55,000 for it. And so that's where I'm starting to look at the $55,000 and feel a little bit better about it, because that's kind of where my estimate is right now. Now, the fifth and final question that I consider is to check my price against the current listing inventory on the market. And that's when I consider the question of what's selling. What's selling refers to the current listing inventory on the market in the target acreage and target location of the subject property that we're comparing it to. This lets me get a gauge on the price points in the market, as well as the activity of views and saves and the traffic on these different listing pages as an indication of the buyer demand for different properties at different price points. For example, this is a $25,000 listing on Shoe Heel Road that just jumps off the screen because the price is so good and it's such a pretty piece of land. But then when you look at the listing description, what you start to see is why it's priced so cheap. You realize that it's priced cheap because it is not qualified for a conventional septic system. And so they know that you basically can't build on that property. And for that reason, you don't want to use that as a reliable gauge of the value of our property, because you want to assume that you can build on our property. This next listing is a $65,000 listing on Lloyd Road. And this gives us a sense of the buyer demand at a price point that's just a little bit higher than our forecast. And what you see is that when you look at the traffic metrics on the Zillow listing, it's been on the market for 52 days, but it only has 199 views and 14 saves. And this indicates to me that the market response to this property right now is a little bit lukewarm. And it suggests that the market's going to want to see a price drop before this property actually gets sold. And the proof of that theory is this next listing, which is this 1.3 acres listed at $50,000. And you can see that it's been on the market for just 7 days and it already has 228 views and 23 saves. And so that's a much more powerful indicator that this property is getting a lot of attention from potential buyers on the market. You can almost hear the water on the kettle start to boil because there's real interest that's bubbling over, and this property is likely to sell, and not just sell, but also sell at a number that's pretty close to the asking price, which is why the attention is so significant. So based on all these things together, looking at all the evidence, I would estimate that on a preliminary basis, without evaluating the environmental features of the property, that our property is probably worth $52,500. That would be my gauge on it. But there's only one problem with that estimate. The problem is it's listed at $45,000 and it's not selling. So how could that be? Because it's almost too good to be true. When you look at the market data, it's very clear that there's a price signal up into the 50s and even closer to 60,000, and yet we're priced at 45 and it's not moving, and it's been on the market for about 4 months. The answer of why that is becomes more apparent when you look on Land ID and you start to evaluate the environmental filters of the property. What you see is that the land is wet. About half the property on the back is covered up in a 100-year flood zone, and the entire property is covered up in wetlands. What that means is that the property, the soil is wet, and because the soil is wet, it's poorly drained. Because it's poorly drained, you most likely can't install a septic system to build a home on that property, which means that the property is not buildable, which means that the property's a dud. And the listing agent knows it. You know, she's sitting there by the phone, she's looking at the days on market, and she realizes that the minute that a buyer puts it under contract and sends the septic application over to the county, a couple weeks after that, she's going to get a panicked call from the buyer who's going to tell her that the deal is off because it didn't perk, because that's exactly what's going to happen. But the point is, when you make an offer, you don't have to know all this stuff. All you have to do is make reasonable assumptions. When I make an offer, I put the offer contingent on confirmation of suitable soils. And if this property had suitable soils, it would be worth $52,500, but it doesn't. But the problem is you can't know that. So you shouldn't try. You can't know all the stuff that you need to know about every single property when you're on the phone with the seller, because the time it takes to finish your research is significant enough that if you researched every property to the bone before you made an offer, you'd never make any offers. So you have to make your offers conditional on verification of the development potential that you're looking for. But that doesn't stop you from looking at local market data and getting a really good gauge on what the property would be worth once you do confirm those details. That reminds me of the next video on our channel that gets into the topic of these listings of really great property that for whatever reason is still available on the market. And that's right, you guessed it, that land hasn't sold for a reason. And if you watch the next video, I think you're going to enjoy it and you're going to learn why.